In every workplace, we expect a certain level of respect and professionalism, but what happens when that respect is shattered and racial prejudice takes over? Picture this: it's another busy afternoon at a corporate office. Employees are going about their usual tasks when something completely unexpected happens. A racist outburst from the manager, directed at one of the black employees. The tension in the room is palpable, but what's even more shocking is what happens next. You can almost hear the silence after the manager's harsh words. The employee, clearly stunned, doesn't respond the way most people might expect. Instead of retreating, staying silent, or just walking away, the employee does something that leaves everyone in the room, including the manager, in shock. The situation quickly spirals into something no one could have predicted: an altercation that will forever change the dynamics of the workplace. It's a situation where power, race, and courage collide, and no one is quite sure how things will play out. For the employee, this isn't just a moment of standing up to disrespect, it's a pivotal moment that challenges everything about their identity and strength. But as the room watches, waiting for the next move, the situation takes a turn that no one could have anticipated. What happens next might surprise you. It's a story of resilience, unexpected alliances, and the fight for justice in a place where people were supposed to feel safe. But as the tension grows, one question remains: how far will this situation go, and will anyone be brave enough to step up and make things right? Stay tuned to find out what happens when this manager's prejudices meet their unexpected consequences. Trust me, you won't see it coming. The office had always been a place of routine. Every morning, employees arrived at the same time, exchanged the usual greetings, and settled into their cubicles, getting lost in spreadsheets, emails, and deadlines. But today, something felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension that nobody could quite place, though everyone felt it. The manager, who had built a reputation for being tough but fair, seemed more on edge than usual. It wasn't just the usual stress that came with the job, no, today something else was brewing. For one employee, this wasn't just another day at work. It was the culmination of months of subtle microaggressions, offhand comments, and thinly veiled insults. She had been with the company for years, diligently working her way up from an entry-level position. She had always kept her head down, focused on her tasks, and never caused a stir. But as the weeks went on, it became impossible to ignore the tension from the manager. He would make small comments about her attitude, or the way she spoke, comments that seemed to get more pointed each time. She had brushed it off, hoping that maybe he was just having a bad day, or maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew something was off. Today, however, everything changed. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This time, the manager's words were sharp and intentional, laced with something far darker. It started with a simple mistake, nothing serious, just a miscommunication about a report. But the manager exploded, his face red with anger. He didn't even take a moment to calm down or assess the situation. Instead, he pointed at her, his voice rising. "You people never get things right," he said, his words cutting through the room like a knife. The silence that followed was deafening. Her coworkers glanced around nervously, unsure whether they should intervene. But no one said a word. They were all used to the manager's volatility. But this was different. This was no longer about work. This was personal. The employee stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. For a split second, she thought about walking away, letting it go, and keeping her head down as she had done for so long. But something inside her snapped. She had taken enough. The silent acceptance of discrimination had drained her for too long. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on them. She could feel every set of eyes on her, waiting for her to respond. In that moment, something inside her clicked into place. No more silence. No more playing small. She didn't yell back. She didn't match his anger. Instead, she said calmly and firmly, "You don't get to talk to me like that. Not anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any argument or insult she could have thrown back. It was as if she had just shattered the illusion of control the manager had held over everyone in the room. There was a long pause, where the only sound was the soft hum of the office air conditioning. The manager looked at her, his eyes narrowing. His mouth twitched as if he were about to say something, anything to retake control of the situation. But then he stopped. He looked around the room, at the other employees who were now visibly uncomfortable, and something shifted in his demeanor. For the first time in a long while, the manager was unsure. The employees who had been nervously shifting in their seats began to take notice. Some of them had witnessed the manager's outbursts before, but this was different. The usual pattern had been that everyone would just let things slide. They had learned to ignore the small, insidious remarks, hoping things would change or that someone else would speak up. But now, they were forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the environment they had been tolerating was more toxic than any of them had realized. One of the employees, a colleague who had always been quick to laugh off the manager's comments, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Others stared down at their desks, pretending to be absorbed in their work, but the tension was undeniable. It was clear that this moment wasn't just about the manager and the employee anymore. It was about the entire office, about everything that had been left unsaid, and the courage it would take for anyone to speak up. The manager's face reddened again, but this time it wasn't just from anger. There was something else, something darker. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who held the power, the one who could say what he wanted without anyone challenging him. And now, for the first time, someone had stood up to him. Not just stood up, but had done so with an unwavering calmness that made him look unsteady. The employee's statement wasn't just about confronting racism. It was about reclaiming control over her dignity, over her space, and over the narrative that had been forced upon her for so long. The shock on the manager's face was evident. He stumbled for words, unable to process the shift. But then, just when it seemed like he might explode again, something unexpected happened. Another employee, someone who had always been quiet and reserved, stood up. They didn't speak loudly or make a grand gesture. But they stood quietly, their backs straight, their posture speaking volumes. It was a small but powerful act of solidarity. It was as though, in that moment, the office as a whole was being forced to reckon with its own complicity. The employees who had remained silent for so long now found themselves grappling with their own choices. Had they, too, allowed this environment to thrive by not standing up sooner? The manager glanced at the employee who had stood up in solidarity, and then at the others around the room. It was clear that he had never expected anyone to challenge his authority like this. But now, faced with not just one but two employees calling him out, the power dynamic was shifting in ways he had never anticipated. The tension in the room escalated, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. The manager's hands were trembling now, and his face was pale. He had lost the upper hand, and with it, his usual air of arrogance. The room that once felt small now seemed impossibly large, and every person in it was holding their breath. But just as it seemed like the moment would explode, the manager turned abruptly and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The employees were left standing in the wake of the confrontation. What had just happened? Was this the end of it, or was this just the beginning? No one knew for sure, but one thing was clear: everything had changed. The quiet compliance that had once defined the office was no longer an option. Things would never be the same again. The question was, where would it go from here? The employee who had been targeted by the manager sat down at her desk, her hands still shaking. She wasn't sure what the next step would be. There were still so many unknowns. Would the manager come back? Would there be consequences for speaking up? Would the office turn against her, or would this moment inspire others to finally take action? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her, but she also knew that something had shifted. She had spoken up, and in doing so, she had sparked something in the others. She had no idea where it would lead, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't be silenced again. Not now, not ever. But as the hours ticked by and the rest of the office slowly returned to normal, the question remained: would anyone else stand up? Would the manager face consequences for his actions, or would his power allow him to slip away without any repercussions? The suspense hung in the air, unanswered and unresolved. The next chapter of this story was waiting to be written, and only time would tell what the true consequences would be for everyone involved. The hours after the confrontation felt like days. The office that had once felt like a familiar space now seemed foreign. People went about their work. But there was an undercurrent of tension that couldn't be ignored. The silence that had followed the manager's exit was unsettling, as if everyone were waiting for something, waiting for the next move, for someone to break the silence. But no one spoke. No one asked about the manager or addressed what had just happened. The status quo, it seemed, had been disturbed, and no one knew how to react. The employee who had been targeted found herself consumed by thoughts. Her heart still raced, and her hands trembled every time she thought about the exchange. She hadn't expected it to unfold the way it had. No one ever does. But she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. Speaking up had felt like an act of liberation, but with that relief came an unsettling awareness of the consequences that might follow. She had done something she knew was right, but the uncertainty of what might come next loomed over her like a dark cloud. As the days passed, it became clear that things weren't going to go back to normal. The manager hadn't returned to the office, and rumors started swirling about his absence. Some said he was on a leave of absence, others whispered that he had been reprimanded, but no one knew for sure. What people did know was that the office felt different. The air was thick with unspoken questions and fears. Everyone was wondering what would happen if the manager came back. Would he be more cautious, or would he return with even more fury? Would there be retaliation? Among her coworkers, there was a wide range of reactions. Some were supportive, offering kind words when they saw her, but others were noticeably uncomfortable, unsure of how to interact. A few of the employees who had remained silent during the confrontation started distancing themselves from her, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because they didn't know how to handle what had happened. They had been complicit in the toxic environment, whether they realized it or not, and now they were left grappling with the reality of their own inaction. One of her colleagues, who had stood up in silent solidarity with her after the manager had left, quietly approached her later that afternoon. They didn't say much at first, just exchanged a few glances before the silence grew heavy. "You did the right thing," they finally said, their voice low but steady. She nodded, not knowing exactly how to respond. "I just couldn't take it anymore." There was a pause, and the weight of the situation seemed to settle between them. "It's not just about one person. It's bigger than that," they said, looking around the office. "I think it's time we all start looking at things differently. The way things have been. It can't go on." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, she wondered if she was hearing them right. Was this person actually ready to speak up too? Or were they simply caught up in the moment, thinking they could make a difference without truly understanding what that would mean? She couldn't tell. It was then that she realized just how deep the problem went. It wasn't just the manager. He was only one piece of a larger, more complex puzzle. The office culture had been built on a foundation of unchecked power, quiet racism, and an unspoken agreement to turn a blind eye to the uncomfortable realities that had taken root over the years. There had been whispers, sure, but nothing ever came to light. No one ever pushed back. No one had the courage to stand up until now. But standing up had consequences. She knew that now. If the manager returned, There would be a reckoning, and not just with him but with the entire office culture. She couldn't help but wonder how many others would actually back her up if it came to that. Meanwhile, the manager's absence created its own sense of unease. While the rumors about him swirled, his silence left a void. His sudden departure made people question how much power he really had. Was he untouchable, or had something truly changed? There were whispers of people behind the scenes making calls, trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Was it a disciplinary matter? Was there something deeper at play, something that had been kept hidden for a long time? Days turned into weeks, and still, no one knew. The employee couldn't shake the feeling that this was all building to something bigger. The quiet moments in the break room, the nervous glances exchanged in hallways, the hesitation before any conversation with management, everything felt loaded, as if the whole office was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would finally come crashing down. Then, one afternoon, an email circulated from upper management. It was short, simple, and almost too calculated. It read, "We acknowledge recent events in the office and are currently reviewing the situation. Your patience and cooperation are appreciated as we address the matter accordingly. We will keep you updated." The email was vague, and the lack of clarity made it worse. It didn't tell anyone what was happening behind the scenes, but it did nothing to ease the rising tension in the office. It felt like a band-aid over a wound that was too deep to heal with a few words. In the days following the email, employees began to talk more openly among themselves, especially the ones who had kept quiet before. The fear of retribution that had once kept them silent now seemed less potent. They had seen one person stand up. Maybe it was time to stand together, to take a stand as a collective. Maybe it was time to finally confront the toxicity that had shaped their lives for so long. But with each conversation, the stakes grew higher. What if standing up wasn't enough? What if the system was too broken to fix? For the employee who had first confronted the manager, the dilemma now was whether to keep pushing forward. She had opened a door that could never be closed again, but what would she find on the other side? Would she find support, or would she be left standing alone? And what if the manager came back with more hostility than before? Each day, the weight of those questions grew heavier. Her sense of purpose was strong, but so was her fear of what might come. She knew that one way or another, things would escalate. Whether it would be a small shift in power, or whether the confrontation would force something larger to unfold, she had no idea. But the uncertainty was maddening. And so, she continued to wait, knowing that the only way forward was through the tension, the conflict, and the unknowns that lay ahead. Would the truth finally come to light? Or would everything fall apart before it could be fixed? Only time would tell. The suspense hung in the air, unanswered, unresolved. And in the quiet of the office, it was clear that nothing would be the same again. The days dragged on in the office, and every moment seemed to build towards something inevitable. The feeling of dread was thick in the air, lingering in the corners of every hallway and cubicle. The employees had all started to notice the subtle changes in the atmosphere. There were fewer casual conversations, more glances exchanged when the door to the manager's office creaked open. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to break, waiting for the storm that seemed to be coming but hadn't yet arrived. The employee who had stood up to the manager felt like she was carrying the weight of the office on her shoulders. She had hoped that standing up for herself would spark a chain of change, but instead, it had made everything more uncertain. The email from management had promised an update, but it hadn't delivered any clarity. In fact, it had only added to the mystery. Every employee knew that the manager was still the key figure in the office. His absence had created a vacuum of power, but no one knew when, or if, he would return. The tension between the employees was palpable. Some were clearly itching for resolution. They had seen how quickly the manager had cracked under pressure, and were beginning to wonder if they, too, should speak up. There were whispers, but no one had the courage to take that first step. A few people had started approaching the employee who had confronted the manager, asking what had happened, as if they were trying to gauge what risks they might be taking by getting involved. But each time, her answers were vague. She wasn't sure what would happen next either. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't just the manager. The entire office, it seemed, was caught in a quiet standoff. People had either distanced themselves or circled around her like wary animals, unsure of how things might go down. A growing sense of anxiety filled the space, the kind of unease that settled deep in the stomach and lingered throughout the workday. Then, one morning, the manager showed up. It was as if the calm before the storm had broken in an instant. He walked into the office as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just disappeared for weeks. The silence that followed his entrance was deafening. The entire office froze, watching, waiting for anything to happen. His eyes scanned the room, meeting no one's gaze. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the events that had transpired. He walked straight to his office, closing the door behind him with a deliberate, almost theatrical motion. The employees could hear the soft murmur of conversation as they turned to each other, exchanging uneasy glances. The manager's return was the spark that everyone had been dreading, the moment that they all knew would ignite everything that had been building up. In the days that followed, the office became a pressure cooker. No one knew whether the manager would confront the employee who had stood up to him, or if he would try to regain control by targeting others. The office was filled with tension, with each passing moment heightening the sense of uncertainty. People began to avoid each other more, as though any wrong word or action could trigger something irreversible. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, like it was amplifying the discomfort that lingered in the space. But it wasn't just the employees who were on edge. The manager, too, was unraveling. For all his attempts to act like nothing had happened, there was a change in him. His usual confident, almost arrogant demeanor had been replaced by something darker, something brittle. He was clearly on edge, snapping at employees for the smallest mistakes, hovering over people's shoulders more than usual. It was as though he knew that the power he once wielded with ease was slipping from his grasp. And then, one afternoon, it happened. The employee who had confronted the manager was called into a meeting. She was told it was just a routine check-in, a conversation to clear the air, but she knew better. She could feel the weight of the moment as she walked into the conference room, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The manager was already sitting at the table, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she wondered if this was the moment where everything would come crashing down. The tension in the room was suffocating. The manager looked at her, his gaze sharp, but there was a strange hesitance in his eyes. He cleared his throat, the sound almost too loud in the silence. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, his voice low but edged with something cold. "And that's not how things are done here." Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was the moment. This was the confrontation that had been coming. But she didn't back down. She sat up straighter, her hands steady on the table. "I didn't cause anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I simply stood up for myself. And for everyone else who's been ignored." The manager's face twisted slightly. There was a flicker of something that looked like fear, or maybe just the recognition of losing control, but it was gone in an instant. "You think this is some kind of game?" he asked, his voice rising just a little. "You think you can challenge me and get away with it?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not playing any games. But you've been getting away with it for far too long. And maybe it's time someone said something." The silence in the room was suffocating now. The manager didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his eyes never leaving her. For a brief moment, she thought he might finally relent, maybe even admit the truth. But the look in his eyes told her something else. He was calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control. Her heart raced as she realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The manager wasn't going to let this slide. The office wasn't going to return to normal. Something was going to change, but what exactly? Her thoughts raced, her pulse quickening as the seconds stretched on. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Would the manager lash out? Would anyone step in to stop him? Or was this finally the beginning of the reckoning she had been waiting for? The door to the conference room opened, and a figure stepped inside, casting a long shadow across the room. It was another manager, one she hadn't seen much of before, but there was something about their presence that shifted the energy in the room. They exchanged a brief glance with the first manager, and the atmosphere seemed to thicken. For a moment, she thought the situation might de-escalate. But instead, the two managers shared a look that made her blood run cold. This was far from over. The new manager stepped into the room, and the tension in the air shifted. It was as if a new variable had been introduced, one that no one had been expecting. The first manager, still leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, shot a sharp look toward the newcomer. For a moment, they didn't say anything, just exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. The atmosphere, already heavy with unspoken words, seemed to thicken. It was as if the walls were closing in, and every breath felt too loud. The employee felt her pulse quicken. She'd been prepared for a confrontation with the first manager, but now there was an unpredictable second player in the mix. She had no idea what was going on. Who was this new person? Why had they come in now, at this exact moment? The uncertainty only deepened the growing sense of dread. The newcomer stood by the door, silent, waiting. Then, with a sudden motion, they walked over to the table and sat down, not saying a word. The stillness was unnerving. The two managers looked at each other again, and this time, there was something different in their gaze, something that felt almost rehearsed. Finally, the first manager spoke, his voice strained but controlled. "We need to handle this. Now." The new manager nodded, and her heart sank as she realized that whatever had been brewing in the background was about to come to the forefront. She could feel the weight of their words, the unspoken pressure building with every passing second. Something big was happening, but she had no idea what it was. "Listen," the first manager continued, leaning forward, "you made a big mistake. And now we're going to deal with it." The employee's stomach turned. She could feel the shift in power. Her instincts screamed at her that this was a pivotal moment. The manager's words were cold, calculated, like a chess player preparing for the final move. But then, the second manager spoke, breaking the tension in a way that no one had expected. "You think this is about a mistake?" The new manager's voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was an edge to it that made the air crackle with tension. "You think this is just about one confrontation? You're missing the bigger picture here." The first manager's eyes narrowed, his brows furrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" The second manager's gaze flicked briefly to the employee, then back to the first manager. "It's not just about what happened with her. It's about everything that's been going on in this office. It's about the culture you've fostered, the culture that has been ignored for so long." The first manager's expression darkened. "This is none of your concern. We're handling this internally." But the second manager didn't back down. "You think she's the problem? You think one person speaking up is what's threatening this entire operation?" There was a quiet intensity in their words now. "It's not her, it's you. It's everything you've let slide over the years. Everything that's been buried." The employee's mind raced. The room felt like it was spinning. What was happening? Was she part of something bigger than she had even realized? She had known the office was toxic, but this was different. The game had changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. But it was becoming clearer that there were forces at play behind the scenes that she had never imagined. The first manager, his usual composure now cracked, slammed his hand on the table. You don't know what you're talking about. The new manager remained calm. Actually, I do. And it's time we address it. The employee could feel the tension between the two managers escalating. Something about the exchange made her uneasy. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire system. She had been a catalyst, yes, but now it was clear that there were deeper layers to this situation than she could have ever imagined. The new manager wasn't just defending her, they were challenging the very structure of power that had been in place for years. And that was something far more dangerous. The door to the conference room opened again, and this time, a familiar face stepped inside. It was a higher up, someone who had been silent through the whole ordeal but whose presence was impossible to ignore. Their entrance only added to the already charged atmosphere. You need to understand something, the higher-up said, their voice sharp and direct. What's happening here isn't just a small issue. This goes all the way to the top. The room went deathly quiet. The weight of the statement hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick with the promise of something far bigger than any of them had realized. The higher-up's words were like a match striking a tinderbox suddenly. Everything felt volatile, unstable. The office had never felt more like a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The employee's heart raced. She hadn't expected any of this. The manager's behavior, the office culture, she had thought those were isolated issues. But now, it was becoming clear that this situation was only the surface. There were deeper currents flowing beneath, and she was caught right in the middle of it. The first manager stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is over. You're out of line. But the higher-up remained unmoved. We don't get to decide that anymore. Not after everything that's come to light. The second manager added, their voice almost a whisper now, the truth has a way of catching up with people. And it's about to catch up with all of us. For a split second, everything went quiet. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. The employee looked between the managers, her mind racing. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: the stakes had just been raised, and everything she had known about this office was about to come crashing down. The higher-up turned toward her, their eyes softening for just a moment. We need you to understand this goes much deeper than what's happened between you and your manager. They paused, letting the weight of their words sink in. You've started something that can't be undone. And neither of us can control what happens next. The tension in the room was unbearable now. The power struggles, the whispered threats, and the uncertain future, everything was spiraling out of control. No one knew where this was going, but it was clear that the resolution was nowhere near. The office was on the brink of something much bigger, and the quiet storm that had been brewing for years was about to break wide open. And in that moment, the employee realized she was no longer just a witness. She was now a key player in a game that none of them had anticipated. The room was thick with tension, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. The higher-up's words hung in the air, a heavy silence filling the space as everyone waited, unsure of what would come next. The employees had been silent witnesses to the power struggles for so long, but now, with the higher-up's admission, they were all implicated. The truth, whatever it was finally coming to light. And none of them were prepared for the impact. The first manager, his face flushed with anger, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. You think this is going to change anything? You think I'm going to just let this all fall apart? His eyes locked onto the higher-up, his tone desperate but tinged with disbelief. The higher-up didn't flinch. The truth doesn't care about what we want. It's time to face the consequences. They turned toward the employee, who was standing motionless, still trying to process what was happening. What you did, standing up to him, it wasn't just about you. It was about everything that's been festering under the surface for years. The people here have been waiting for someone to speak out, someone to bring it to light. And now, it's happening. The employee's mind raced, but there was no time to sort through the flood of emotions. The first manager's control was slipping, and she could see it. His usual bravado had cracked, and in its place was a man who felt like he was losing everything. "You think I'm the problem?" The first manager's voice shook as he turned to the second manager. "You think you're going to expose me like this? You don't know anything about what I've built here. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made." The second manager shook their head, their gaze unwavering. "It's not about the sacrifices, it's about the lies. You've created a toxic environment, manipulated people for your own benefit. And now it's time for all of that to come to an end." The employee's heart pounded as she realized what was at stake. This wasn't just a personal conflict anymore, it was about the future of the entire office, the culture that had been poisoned for years. She had sparked something much bigger than herself, and there was no turning back. For a moment, the room was still. The tension was palpable, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. Then, unexpectedly, the first manager collapsed into his chair, his shoulders slumping. "I've worked my whole life for this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice cracked, the weight of his failures finally catching up with him. The higher-up stepped closer. "You've worked to build something, but at what cost? How many people have you hurt to get here?" There was a long pause. The office felt suffocating, like 1,000 eyes were watching, waiting for the next move. The employee looked around the room, seeing faces filled with uncertainty, some filled with hope. It wasn't just about her anymore. She realized that the entire office was in this together now, whether they liked it or not. But just as the first manager seemed on the verge of breaking, a new voice cut through the silence. "I think you all have missed the point." Everyone turned toward the door, where a familiar figure stood, a senior executive who had been largely absent during the entire ordeal. The room seemed to freeze as the executive walked in, a smug expression on their face. The higher-up's face darkened as they stepped forward, but the executive raised a hand to stop them. "Let me make one thing clear," the executive said, their tone cool and detached. "All of this, the drama, the supposed confrontation, none of it matters in the grand scheme of things. The truth is, we've known about the issues here for years. We've watched this all play out. But none of you have any real power to change it." The employee's heart sank. She had thought they were on the verge of exposing everything, of finally bringing accountability to the surface. But this was something else entirely. The executive continued, their voice low and controlled. "The higher-ups have already made their decision. The changes you think are coming? They're not. This office is staying exactly as it is." The room fell into stunned silence. The second manager looked stunned, their face pale as they tried to process what was happening. The first manager, still reeling from his emotional breakdown, couldn't even look up. The employee's hands clenched into fists, her entire body tense with disbelief. She had been so sure, so certain that this moment the confrontation, the exposure, the reckoning would lead to a better future. But now, it felt like everything had just been pulled out from under her. The executive looked around the room, their eyes sweeping over the employees as if measuring them, weighing them. "This is the reality," they said flatly. "Power doesn't shift because you want it to. It shifts because we let it. And right now, we're letting it stay exactly where it is." The weight of their words settled like a leaden blanket. It was as if the rug had been pulled out from under everyone in the room, and the employee felt her legs wobble as the shock set in. All this effort, all the tension, all the hope, it had amounted to nothing. The office was going to stay the same. The power dynamic was unchanged. She had stood up, spoken out, but it felt like she was still powerless. But then, just when she thought everything had fallen apart, the executive's expression shifted. There was something in their eyes, a hint of something darker, something more calculating than before. "Of course," they said, As if considering something carefully, there's one way we could make some adjustments. The room tensed again, the employees looking at each other in confusion. The higher-ups seemed to sense the change, their expression hardening as they took a step toward the executive. "What are you saying?" The executive smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was one that sent a chill down the spine. "What I'm saying is that sometimes, the chaos we create is necessary. It keeps things moving. It keeps people guessing. So, let's just say this moment isn't over. Not by a long shot." The employee's mind reeled. What was going on? This wasn't just about the office anymore, it wasn't even just about the managers. This was something else, something far more intricate and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The game had shifted once again, and she had no idea what the final play would be. But she knew, without a doubt, that whatever happened next, it was going to be far more complicated and far more explosive than anything she could have prepared for. The office was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. The room was still as the executive's words lingered in the air. The tension that had been building for what felt like an eternity now seemed to stretch, endlessly suffocating everyone within its grasp. The higher-up looked as though they had just been blindsided, their face a mixture of shock and disbelief. The second manager seemed frozen, caught in a limbo between what had just been said and what they had hoped for. The first manager, still reeling from the emotional blow moments before, was silent, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion. But the executive wasn't finished. There was a sense of finality in their tone, a cold assurance that everything was playing out exactly as they had intended. "You think you've got it all figured out," they said slowly, eyes sweeping across the room. "But let me tell you this, power is a game, and not everyone plays by the same rules." The employee stood, rooted to the spot, struggling to make sense of the shifting dynamics. All the hopes she had clung to seemed to slip through her fingers. She had fought so hard for change, for some form of justice, and now it felt like it was all being torn down, piece by piece. But as the weight of the executive's words settled, something in her began to change. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She took a step forward, her voice steady but tinged with the frustration she could no longer hold back. "You can't just keep playing with people's lives like this. There are real consequences to this kind of manipulation." The executive's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The room, still thick with unease, seemed to shift as the employees looked at one another, quietly acknowledging the fight that had been growing in them all along. "You think you're the only one who's had enough?" The executive finally spoke, but now there was something else in their voice, something that seemed to hint at recognition, a begrudging respect for the defiance in the employee's eyes. "You think this office isn't tired of the same old games?" Their gaze flicked toward the first manager, who had fallen silent, clearly struggling with his next move. "Everyone here is fed up," the second manager interjected, their voice quieter but no less firm. "And maybe that's what you failed to see all along. It's not about one person, one mistake, or one person speaking out. It's about the entire culture you fostered. And it's breaking down." There was a long pause as the executive, still standing by the door, seemed to weigh their next words carefully. It was almost as though they were considering whether or not to reveal more, to break the silence in a way that might reshape everything that had been set up until this point. Finally they spoke again, but this time their voice held a different tone, less mocking, more resigned. "I've been in this game for a long time, and I know how it works. The truth is, the changes you want, they're already happening, just not in the way you think." The employee's heart skipped a beat. What was that supposed to mean? She glanced around, trying to read the room, but everyone was caught in the same web of confusion. The higher-up looked even more wary now, as though they, too, weren't sure of what was about to unfold. The executive stepped forward, now taking a seat at the table, their posture shifting from the commanding figure they had been earlier. "The reality is, what you've all been pushing for has been noticed, they said, the words deliberate, calculated. But not by the people you thought. The higher-ups who have been pulling the strings. They're not as untouchable as you think. The room seemed to shift again, like the ground was suddenly giving way. The employee's mind raced. Had the tide truly turned? Was the change she had been hoping for finally within reach? Of course, the executive continued, it's not going to happen overnight. The system is still rigged, and there's no such thing as a smooth transition. But there's a shift, whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not. A murmur went through the room. The first manager's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. The second manager looked over at the employee, their expression softening just a little. Does this mean, the second manager began hesitantly, that things are going to change for real? The executive nodded, but the gesture seemed cautious. I can't promise a revolution. I can't promise that everything will be fixed right away. But I will say this: things are moving. The old way of doing business is being questioned, and it won't be long before the entire structure starts to crumble. The employee felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, the weight that had been pressing on her chest felt just a little bit lighter. There was still so much uncertainty, so much left to be done, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The higher-up spoke again, voice tinged with disbelief. I never thought this day would come, they said, almost to themselves. But you're right. There's no going back now. The first manager, who had been silent for what seemed like hours, stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger again. You can't just change things like this. You can't just rewrite everything because of one outburst. His voice was shaky, but it still carried the edge of authority he had once wielded so confidently. The second manager turned to the first, their tone firm. It's not just one outburst. It's years of frustration. Years of watching people suffer under a system that was never meant to be fair. The employee took a deep breath. She could feel the shift, the momentum that had been building. It was happening piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But it was progress. As the conversation continued, the weight of everything that had been said started to settle in. The office had been a battleground, a place where power and control had been the ultimate currency. But now, for the first time, it felt like the balance was tipping. There were cracks in the foundation, and the truth was starting to seep through. By the end of the day, there were no immediate resolutions. No one could promise that everything would change overnight. But the employee walked away with a new sense of clarity. She had fought for her voice to be heard, and though it hadn't gone the way she had hoped, she realized that sometimes the most meaningful victories weren't the ones that came with immediate results. The real victory was in the change that was happening, slowly but surely. The first manager's authority had been shaken. The toxic culture that had once dominated the office was beginning to fray at the edges. And while it was far from perfect, there was a sense of hope now, hope that one day, things might finally be different. As she left the building, the employee couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The confrontation, the moments of doubt, the unexpected twists, it had all led to this point. And though there were still challenges ahead, she knew that change was possible. The system might have been rigged, but it wasn't invincible. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.